Ladies and gentlemen, today, we gather not merely to discuss geopolitics, but to confront the soul of humanity itself. The Israel-Gaza conflict has once again reached a critical turning point, one that tests our collective conscience and our faith in peace. The human cost of the Israel-Gaza conflict defies measurement. It stretches beyond borders, beyond political statements, beyond the language of strategy or policy. At its core, this is not merely a war between two entities, it is a continuing tragedy of human lives caught in cycles of violence, displacement, and despair. Every bomb that falls does not just destroy buildings, it shatters generations. Every headline about casualties conceals 1,000 unspoken stories of fathers who never return home, of mothers who search rubble with trembling hands, of children who learn to identify the sound of airstrikes before they learn the alphabet. In Gaza, densely packed and under siege, ordinary people live in a state of constant alertness. The roar of jets overhead is no longer a sound of surprise but of inevitability. Families sleep in shifts, unsure if their homes will still stand by dawn. Hospitals overflow with the injured, their hallways echoing with cries of pain and confusion. The simplest necessities, water, electricity, medicine, become luxuries measured by the hour. When conflict becomes routine, survival itself turns into resistance. Each day lived is an act of courage against overwhelming odds. Across the border in Israel, families hold onto photos and prayers, waiting for the return of those taken hostage. Parents tuck their children into bed while wondering if another siren will tear through the night. Soldiers patrol with heavy hearts, knowing that each decision carries both moral and mortal weight. Even in safety, fear lingers. No wall, no defense system, can guard the human heart from grief. The pain of loss is shared across boundaries, different in circumstance, yet identical in sorrow. Children, the most innocent witnesses, grow up learning that safety is temporary and that hate can become heritage if unchallenged. A 7-year-old in Gaza sketches drones instead of flowers. A 10-year-old in Israel practices emergency drills more often than sports. Their playgrounds are shadowed by politics they cannot understand and histories they did not create. When a generation grows up knowing only checkpoints and airstrikes, the scars are not just physical, they are psychological, inherited, and enduring. Trauma becomes a language passed down quietly, in silence and in fear. Behind every statistic lies a story of interrupted dreams. The young man who once studied to be an engineer now digs through debris looking for his sister. The teacher who taught peace now explains to her students why their classroom windows are shattered. The medic who rushes into danger to save others wonders if his own family will survive the night. These are not political actors, they are human beings whose only desire is to live without fear. The toll of war extends far beyond the battlefield. It infiltrates homes, marriages, friendships, and faith. It steals the innocence of youth and replaces it with resilience that no one should have to earn. Displacement uproots millions, forcing families into camps and uncertainty. The idea of normal life becomes a distant memory, schooling interrupted, jobs lost, futures postponed indefinitely. Communities become ghosts of what they once were, and entire neighborhoods turn into symbols of endurance rather than thriving life. Internationally, the images of destruction and grief ignite anger and empathy, but too often the conversation returns to politics and power. The faces of the victims fade behind debates over borders and blame. Yet every time a diplomat negotiates a truce, somewhere a child learns to fear silence more than noise. Because silence, in war, means waiting for the next strike. The human cost cannot be quantified in treaties or resolutions. It lives in the eyes of those who have seen too much and in the hearts of those who still hope amid ruins. This conflict teaches a brutal truth, that war, once begun, does not end when the guns fall silent. It endures in memory, in culture, in the unspoken grief that binds generations together. The wounds of Gaza and Israel are not isolated, they are reflections of our shared failure to protect what is most sacred, the sanctity of human life. Each lost soul is not a casualty of geography but of humanity's collective inability to learn from its past. The human cost of this conflict will not be written only in history books but carried in the DNA of those who survive, whispering to the next generation what it means to live through the unending echo of war. Hostage negotiations stand as one of the most difficult and delicate moral challenges in times of conflict. In the Israel-Gaza crisis, they have become a mirror reflecting not only the strategies of governments but the conscience of humanity itself. Every hostage represents far more than a political asset or a negotiation tool. They embody the essence of moral responsibility, the undeniable truth that every human life has value beyond calculation or convenience. When individuals are taken and held between warring powers, the conflict stops being abstract. It becomes painfully personal, visible in the faces of those waiting, pleading, and praying for their loved one's return. Each negotiation for a hostage's release becomes a test of how deeply the world values compassion over control, empathy over ego, and life over leverage. Behind closed doors, Political leaders and mediators balance impossible choices. Every word uttered in negotiation rooms carries the weight of lives suspended in uncertainty. To rescue one captive may require concessions that seem politically risky. To delay may mean death. And yet, these decisions reveal the priorities of nations, whether they see human lives as sacred or as pieces on a geopolitical chessboard. In Israel, the families of hostages live in an agony that no briefing or statement can capture. Their lives are paused between hope and heartbreak. Every day that passes without news is an emotional trial of endurance. They become unwilling symbols of patience and pain, their loved ones transformed into instruments of diplomacy. The anguish of waiting becomes its own form of captivity. When images or proof of life surface, the relief is momentary, followed by the torment of renewed uncertainty. Their grief and their faith are both stretched beyond human limits. In Gaza, those held hostage are often kept in darkness literally and figuratively. They become invisible to the world, existing in the shadow of propaganda and fear. Their captors claim justification, invoking ideology, retaliation, or survival. But to hold another human being as a shield or bargaining chip is to place politics above humanity. It is a moral collapse that corrodes both the oppressor and the oppressed. The true measure of any cause is how it treats the helpless, not how it punishes the powerful. The international community faces its own trial during these negotiations. Nations watch and weigh their responses carefully, caught between principle and pragmatism. Some demand unconditional releases, others advocate for broader peace deals that link freedom with ceasefire terms. In these moments, diplomacy becomes an act of moral theater, the world observing whether the actors on stage perform with sincerity or strategy. Every decision echoes far beyond the room, shaping the global perception of justice, empathy, and power. For mediators, those few entrusted to speak for both sides, the burden is immense. They navigate a labyrinth of mistrust and propaganda, searching for slivers of common humanity amid layers of hostility. Each word must be chosen with surgical precision, each gesture calibrated to preserve both dignity and dialogue. Their work is rarely celebrated because true success in hostage negotiations is invisible. It happens quietly, without victory speeches or applause. The joy of release is tempered by the trauma of captivity, and even when hostages return home, the scars remain etched in their minds and families. The moral responsibility surrounding these negotiations extends beyond the leaders and negotiators. It belongs to all who watch, comment, and judge from afar. In the age of instant media, the suffering of hostages and their families becomes a form of public spectacle, often distorted by misinformation and political framing. Yet, amid this noise, one simple truth must remain clear. The worth of a single human life cannot be reduced to political strategy or national pride. The process of negotiating for hostages is not just about freeing the imprisoned, it is about freeing our shared humanity from indifference. It forces societies to ask difficult questions. How far will we go to save one person? What compromises are too great? And what does it say about us if we allow politics to outweigh compassion? Each time the world witnesses a hostage negotiation, it is reminded that morality is not tested in times of comfort but in moments of crisis. The outcome reveals not only who holds the power but who still holds onto their humanity. A ceasefire, in the context of the Israel-Gaza conflict, is often hailed as a victory of diplomacy, a moment of relief after relentless devastation. But beneath the surface of silence, it is fragile, trembling with mistrust, fear, and unhealed wounds. A truce is not peace, it is a temporary pause in violence, a narrow bridge between war and reconciliation that can collapse with a single act of defiance or misunderstanding. Ceasefire talks are among the most complex forms of negotiation because they demand not just agreement on paper, but transformation of mindset, behavior, and belief. True peace cannot grow in the soul of suspicion. It requires trust, and trust, once broken, is the rarest currency in the world of conflict. When diplomats gather to discuss a ceasefire, they are not simply trying to stop rockets or airstrikes. They are attempting to reconstruct an entire emotional landscape shattered by decades of enmity. Every term in a ceasefire agreement is loaded with history, shaped by grievances that reach back generations. Words like withdrawal, security, blockade, or recognition carry more than legal meaning. They hold the weight of blood, betrayal, and survival. Negotiators sit across from one another not as equals in peace, but as survivors of pain, carrying the ghosts of lost lives behind them. To convince such sides to trust each other, even briefly, is to perform one of the most difficult acts of diplomacy known to humankind. In Gaza, the announcement of a ceasefire often brings fleeting relief. Families venture out to assess what remains of their homes, neighbors reunite amid ruins, and aid trucks begin to move again. Yet even as people breathe more freely, anxiety lingers. Everyone knows how easily a single airstrike, rocket, or accusation can shatter the calm. A child's laughter in the streets is still shadowed by the memory of sirens. The quiet that follows war is not silence, it is the heavy breathing of exhaustion, the fragile hope that tomorrow will not bring another round of violence. In Israel, the word ceasefire often arrives with mixed emotions. Citizens long for safety but fear that every truce only delays the inevitable next attack. Soldiers stationed at the borders remain alert, their eyes trained on movements across the line, because in this region, even a handshake can conceal hesitation. Trust is a word repeated in speeches but rarely felt in hearts. The trauma of loss keeps wounds open on both sides, preventing empathy from taking root. International mediators and peace brokers attempt to build frameworks that can hold this delicate truce. Together, humanitarian corridors, monitoring mechanisms, guarantees from third-party nations. But none of these structures can endure without genuine trust between the parties themselves. A ceasefire held by fear is temporary. A ceasefire built on understanding has a chance to evolve into peace. Yet, the path toward trust is steep. It begins with recognizing each other's suffering, acknowledging mistakes, and refraining from demonization, acts that require immense moral courage. In political terms, ceasefires are often tactical pauses used to reorganize forces, reposition diplomacy, or gain public support. But for civilians, they are lifelines, a chance to bury the dead, to search for the missing, to feel the wind without the smell of smoke. The dissonance between political objectives and human desperation defines the fragility of every truce. Those who suffer most from the conflict are rarely those sitting at the negotiation table. Mistrust runs deep because history in this region has been written in cycles of ceasefire and collapse, promises made and broken, declarations issued and ignored. Generations have grown up watching peace agreements dissolve like sand in water. To rebuild trust requires transparency, accountability, and time-free things in short supply during war. Each violation of a ceasefire, however small, reopens old fears. A single explosion can erase weeks of progress, reminding everyone that promises are fragile and memory unforgiving. Trust cannot be negotiated in conference halls alone. It must be lived in daily actions, through humanitarian cooperation, shared reconstruction efforts, the release of prisoners, and the protection of civilians. When both sides see that restraint brings more safety than aggression, the ceasefire begins to mature into something deeper. But until then, every pause in gunfire remains uncertain, held together by thin strands of hope and diplomacy. The fragility of ceasefire talks reveals the complexity of human conflict, how two peoples bound by geography can be divided by history, and how silence after war can sound both peaceful and perilous at once. The road from ceasefire to peace is not paved with documents but with acts of trust, each one fragile, each one vital, and each one standing between the memory of war and the possibility of healing. The Israel-Gaza conflict has never been a local issue confined to two territories separated by fences and ideology. It has always been a fulcrum on which global politics turns. Every decision made in this region, whether a military strike, a ceasefire, or a negotiation, sends ripples far beyond its borders, influencing international relations, global security strategies, and domestic political debates in countries oceans away. The echoes of Gaza and Israel reach Washington, London, Brussels, and beyond, reshaping alliances, testing leadership, and redefining moral boundaries in real time. For the United States, the conflict represents a defining test of its foreign policy identity. For decades, the U.S. has positioned itself as both Israel's staunchest ally and a self-proclaimed advocate for peace in the Middle East. This dual role demands a balance that grows more difficult with each escalation. Every decision made by the White House, whether to call for restraint, veto a UN resolution, or approve an arms shipment, carries profound consequences. Support for Israel remains a cornerstone of American foreign policy, yet it also invites global scrutiny and domestic division. Within the U.S., the debate over how far that support should go has become a flashpoint between moral obligation, strategic interest, and political pragmatism. The conflict's influence on American politics extends deep into its social fabric. On college campuses, protests erupt demanding justice for Palestinians or solidarity with Israel, and in Congress, lawmakers split along ideological and generational lines. Progressive voices call for accountability and human rights, while traditional foreign policy advocates emphasize security and alliance. This tension shapes electoral discourse, affects campaign funding, and redefines the boundaries of public opinion. The images broadcast from Gaza do not just affect hearts, they shift votes, policies, and the future direction of U.S. diplomacy. Globally, the Israel-Gaza conflict operates as a barometer for international alignments. Russia and China use it as a lens through which to challenge Western narratives, portraying the U.S. as selective in its advocacy for democracy and human rights. Nations in the global South, long skeptical of Western moral leadership, interpret the conflict as proof of double standards, seeing swift Western unity in some wars but silence in others. Thus, the actions of Israel and Hamas become more than regional tactics. They become rhetorical tools in a wider global struggle for legitimacy and influence. In Europe, governments grapple with their own internal divides. The European Union issues statements calling for peace and humanitarian access, yet its member states differ sharply in tone and emphasis. France and Spain often lean toward stronger calls for restraint and accountability, while Germany and others remain firm in their support for Israel's right to defense. These divisions weaken Europe's collective diplomatic voice, exposing the difficulty of forming a unified stance on one of the most enduring and emotional conflicts of the modern era. In the Middle East itself, the implications are even more direct. Neighboring countries such as Egypt, Jordan, and Qatar play critical roles as mediators, walking a diplomatic tightrope between Western expectations and regional sentiment. Each flare-up threatens to destabilize fragile balances of power, inflame domestic unrest, and reshape regional alliances. The Abraham Accords, once celebrated as a breakthrough toward normalization between Israel and Arab nations, face continuous tests as public anger over civilian casualties challenges governments that signed them. The conflict reawakens old fault lines between states prioritizing stability and populations demanding justice. The humanitarian dimension of the conflict further complicates global responses. International organizations like the United Nations and the Red Cross face immense pressure to act but limited power to enforce. Human rights groups demand investigations into war crimes, while humanitarian aid agencies confront blockades and bureaucratic hurdles. Every convoy of food or medicine becomes a symbol of both compassion and failure, revealing how deeply political even acts of mercy have become in this landscape. Energy markets, too, react to every escalation. The Middle East remains central to global oil and gas supply, and each strike or blockade threatens economic shockwaves. Investors and governments alike monitor the conflict not only through moral or political lenses but also through economic ones. Markets fluctuate, trade routes shift, and policy decisions in Washington and Riyadh adjust accordingly. The conflict becomes a factor in inflation, in fuel prices, in the stability of entire economies. Each decision made in Gaza or Israel reverberates through boardrooms, parliaments, and public squares around the world. It redefines how nations interpret justice, how alliances are maintained, and how societies reconcile ethics with interests. The consequences do not end at the borders of the region. They travel through diplomatic cables, economic systems, and digital networks, touching the conscience and calculations of the global order with every passing day. Dialogue and diplomacy are the only instruments capable of transforming the cycle of conflict between Israel and Gaza into a path toward coexistence. In a region where mistrust has been inherited like tradition, where every act of violence reopens centuries of wounds, conversation itself becomes an act of courage. True peace cannot be imposed through power, it must be built through words, empathy, and the willingness to see humanity even in those long perceived as enemies. Dialogue is not weakness, it is discipline, the difficult art of listening to pain that contradicts one's own. Diplomacy, at its best, is not about avoiding conflict but about absorbing anger, transforming it into understanding, and guiding it toward solutions that preserve life rather than destroy it. In every conflict, dialogue begins with silence, the silence that follows exhaustion, loss, and realization that no side can truly win through violence. When guns fall quiet, diplomats and negotiators emerge to face the debris left behind by failed politics. Yet, in the Israel-Gaza context, even initiating a conversation demands extraordinary courage. The history of broken promises and manipulated truces has created an environment where words are often distrusted, as much as weapons. To speak of peace is to walk on shattered ground, knowing that every gesture will be interpreted through layers of suspicion. Still, diplomacy persists because the alternative endless war offers nothing but destruction without meaning. For dialogue to have meaning, it must go beyond political theater. It must begin with acknowledgement of suffering, of displacement, of loss, of fear. When one side speaks of rockets, the other must be allowed to speak of blockades. When one recounts trauma from attacks, the other must be heard about generations growing up under siege. Without space for both narratives, conversation collapses into accusation. Real diplomacy requires humility, the admission that truth is not monopolized by one side. The act of seeing the other's pain does not erase one's own. It broadens the moral horizon of what peace could mean. International mediators play a crucial role in facilitating such dialogue, acting as translators not just of language but of emotion and history. Their task is to create a space where hostility can coexist with hope, where grievances can be aired without reigniting violence. These negotiations are rarely linear, they are filled with setbacks, walkouts, and renewed tensions. Yet each return to the table is itself a victory, a statement that despite anger, there remains a thread of willingness to coexist. Diplomacy functions like the stitching of a wound. It does not erase the scar, but it prevents the bleeding from continuing. The power of dialogue lies in its quiet persistence. While violence dominates headlines, diplomacy often unfolds in hidden rooms, through late-night calls, subtle gestures, and words chosen with surgical care. The most meaningful breakthroughs often occur not in grand summits but in private conversations where human connection briefly overrides ideology. A mediator sharing tea with rivals, a negotiator expressing empathy for a lost child. Such moments, unseen by the world, form the fragile foundation upon which peace can be built. For both Israelis and Palestinians, dialogue demands confronting deeply rooted narratives that have long justified separation. It asks leaders to choose political risk over popular applause, to prioritize compassion over control. This is the true weight of diplomacy, the courage to compromise without surrendering justice, the strength to imagine coexistence where vengeance feels easier. Words become bridges where walls have long stood. Diplomatic engagement also requires sustained international commitment. The world cannot treat negotiations as events. They must be ongoing processes that evolve with the realities on the ground. Too often, global powers intervene briefly, declare symbolic victories, and withdraw, leaving the region to relapse into conflict. Consistent dialogue means consistent presence, not just when the cameras are rolling but in the long, quiet months when trust must be rebuilt piece by piece, in communities on both sides. Grassroots dialogue often precedes political agreements. Civil society organizations, educators, and religious leaders engage in small but powerful acts of reconciliation. Joint projects, youth exchanges, shared prayers, humanitarian cooperation. These local dialogues create ripples that can influence political tides. They remind the world that peace is not born from treaties but from understanding, and that diplomacy begins not in embassies but in hearts willing to listen. Dialogue and diplomacy test patience more than power. They ask for restraint when provocation is easier, for listening when shouting feels justifiable. The transformation of confrontation into conversation is a slow, fragile, and often invisible process, yet it is the only one capable of turning temporary ceasefires into lasting coexistence, the only path through which empathy can begin to replace the language of fear. Hope amid destruction is one of the most profound paradoxes of human existence. In the aftermath of war, when cities crumble and silence replaces the noise of life, it seems almost impossible to imagine that hope could survive. Yet, time and again, history reveals that reconciliation can rise from ruins, that even after decades of division, people can choose empathy over revenge and healing over hatred. The Israel-Gaza conflict, with its relentless cycles of violence, grief, and retaliation, stands as one of the greatest tests of that truth. The destruction is vast, physical, emotional, generational, but beneath the ashes of despair lies a persistent, fragile spark that refuses to die, the human desire to rebuild, to reconnect, to hope. Every war ends in exhaustion, not victory. When bombs fall silent, what remains are shattered families, lost homes, and an overwhelming emptiness that vengeance cannot fill. In Gaza, hope is not a luxury, it is a survival mechanism. It lives in the mother who plants a small garden beside the rubble of her home, in the teacher who gathers children in a broken classroom to remind them that learning is an act of defiance, and in the doctor who treats the wounded with hands that tremble but do not stop. These acts, seemingly ordinary, are in fact declarations of resilience. They say to the world, destruction cannot dictate destiny. Across the border in Israel, hope takes a different form. It lives in those who, despite personal loss, speak out for peace rather than retribution. It survives in communities that choose coexistence programs, in parents who teach their children compassion for those on the other side of the fence. It exists in the quiet voices of soldiers who understand that true strength lies not in domination but in restraint. Even amid trauma, there are people who refuse to surrender to the narrative of eternal conflict, who dare to believe that empathy is not weakness but wisdom. Empathy, however, is not easy to choose. It demands seeing the humanity of those who have caused pain, acknowledging that suffering is shared even when experiences differ. The challenge of empathy is that it requires moral courage, the willingness to feel another's grief while still bearing one's own. Yet, throughout history, reconciliation has always begun with such acts of recognition. After World War II, nations that once annihilated each other rebuilt together. After apartheid, South Africa turned to truth and forgiveness rather than vengeance. These examples do not erase the suffering that came before, but they illuminate a truth the world too often forgets, that revenge perpetuates the past, while empathy opens the future. In the context of Israel and Gaza, the road to reconciliation seems unbearably long. Generations have grown up knowing only fear, propaganda, and pain. Each side holds stories of injustice that feel impossible to forgive. Yet even within this darkness, there are glimpses of humanity that persist. Shared grief has the power to soften even the hardest of walls. When a mother in Gaza weeps for her lost child, and a father in Israel does the same, their tears are indistinguishable. It is within those shared emotions that the seeds of peace can be found, though buried deep beneath anger and loss. Hope, in times of destruction, is not naive optimism. It is a deliberate act of defiance. It is the belief that cycles of violence can be broken by those who have every reason to continue them. The people who have lost the most are often those most capable of teaching the world what endurance truly means. They rebuild homes with fewer materials but stronger hearts. They sing songs of survival where silence once reigned. They dream of peace even when reality mocks them for it. Reconciliation is never a single event but a process measured in generations. It begins in whispers, in small gestures, in simple acts of human recognition that ripple outward over time. Empathy, once chosen, has the power to disarm hatred more effectively than any weapon. The ruins of war have always hidden the roots of new beginnings, and though destruction dominates the landscape today, the will to rise, to connect, and to forgive continues to stir beneath the dust. So let us stand, not as nations divided by ideology, but as people united by the simple truth that every child deserves peace, every family deserves safety, and every soul deserves hope, because at the end of every war, it is not the victors who define the future, it is the survivors who must live it. Thank you, 鸽子。